Trump's 145% tariff hit like a financial grenade. Billions in Chinese goods trapped overnight. Prices set to skyrocket. But Walmart, Amazon, and Target didn't blink. They rerouted half their inventory to Canada before the tariffs were even signed. No delay. Just a strategic pivot into foreign trade zones that let them dodge billions in duties. This wasn't guesswork. It was a precision play, because they didn't just survive the tariff war, they won it. And the part no one's asking who told them when to move, April 2025. A 145% tariff on Chinese imports detonated without warning. No exemptions, no phasing. Within 72 hours, container traffic from Asia cratered. But behind the scenes, supply chain chiefs at Amazon, Walmart, and Target weren't scrambling. They were executing a playbook already in motion. One that used bonded warehouses, Canadian reroutes, and FTZs to sidestep economic disaster. According to data from Sonar Container Atlas, daily ocean container bookings from China to the U.S. dropped by 20% year over year, exposing the scale of this corporate pivot. These weren't improvisations. They were calculated moves based on the hypothesis that tariffs, however steep, would be temporary. And instead of waiting for policy clarity, these firms took preemptive action, redirecting 50% of their China-bound inventory to Canadian ports, bypassing U.S. customs entirely. But that maneuver wasn't just about evasion. It raised a deeper question. How did these companies know when to act before the tariffs even hit foreign trade zones, or FTZs are pockets of U.S. soil that function like offshore docks? Legally, they're considered outside U.S. customs jurisdiction. That technicality allowed companies to import goods into FTZ warehouses without paying tariffs unless or until those goods are released into domestic markets. It's not a loophole. It's a regulatory mechanism built into U.S. trade law. And as of May 2025, it's become the cornerstone of tariff strategy. In North Carolina, nearly the entire state is covered under FTZ classification. In Illinois, one FTZ blankets half the state's southern corridor. According to U.S. Customs filings, applying for FTZ designation costs only a few $1,000s. But the value proposition is exponential. Companies can defer taxes, reduce reclassification penalties, and in some cases select the lowest applicable tariff rate. That flexibility gave retailers critical leverage, but it also forced them into a timing game with massive financial stakes. And not all players had the balance sheet to survive a miscalculation. By mid-April, half of all China-origin shipments, originally destined for U.S. markets, were redirected to Canadian ports. According to reporting from Quinn Patrick and Reuters Trade Tracker, this wasn't a coincidence. Canada offered something the U.S. suddenly didn't: tariff-free limbo. Unlike U.S. ports, Canadian facilities allowed goods to be stored without triggering duties, and Amazon and Walmart moved fast to exploit that differential. The scale was enormous. Vancouver alone processed 7.3 million barrels of Canadian crude bound for China in March, highlighting the port's rising centrality. But behind those oil stats were consumer goods, everything from electronics to apparel, sitting in Canadian warehouses untouched by U.S. tariffs. The long game. Wait out the Trump administration's aggressive policy swing, then re-export at lower costs, or reroute into the U.S. when tariffs fell. But the decision to reroute wasn't just about saving money. It exposed a broader tension. How long can companies hold inventory in a legal gray zone before the strategy breaks? But rerouting was only half the story. The real gamble was timing. And to pull it off, they revived a strategy that most of the world had declared dead: just-in-time inventory. In the post-COVID panic, just-in-case replaced just-in-time across global supply chains. But by 2024, that reversal had reversed. According to Reuters' August 2023 analysis, Home Depot, Target, and Walmart slashed inventory levels despite rising sales. Just-in-time, built on precision forecasting and rapid replenishment, was back. Why? Because storage costs were soaring, and FTZs provided a safety net for unpredictable lead times. What changed wasn't confidence in the system. It was the tools to survive its shocks. FTZs allowed companies to delay customs fees. Bonded warehouses in Canada gave them holding space without penalty. These weren't overcorrections. They were micro-adjustments within an old strategy. But JIT carries a hidden cost vulnerability to supply shocks. And with US-China container volume collapsing and tariff threats escalating, retailers who bet too heavily on lean inventories risk catastrophic stockouts. So what made them keep betting anyway? But even precision carries weight, because behind every timing decision lies a hard number. And a 5-day slip could quietly drain billions from the system before anyone notices. The U.S. inventory to sales ratio, tracked monthly, plummeted to 1.15 during the pandemic. That meant only 35 days of goods were stocked nationwide. It later surged to 1.45 as pandemic gluts kicked in, then stabilized around 1.35, or roughly 40 days. A 5-day shift may seem negligible, but spread across $27 trillion in annual economic output, it equates to tens of billions in warehousing insurance and obsolescence exposure. That's not theoretical, it's measurable drag. Storing goods is expensive. Leasing warehouse space, hiring labor, paying for security, and writing off perishable or unfashionable products all erode margins. That's why retailers never overstock low-margin goods like toilet paper or out-of-season clothing. In this environment, the decision to stockpile in FTZs or Canadian depots wasn't just tactical, it was a hedge against systemic cost volatility. But if 5 days equals billions in friction, then the real cost of supply chain survival isn't just measured in tariffs, it's in time. And the next section reveals exactly what companies risked betting against it. Which begs the question, if the risk was so high, why take it? Why bet on a policy collapse before it even happened? Weeks before tariffs were officially scaled back, major U.S. retailers made a counterintuitive move. They resumed orders from Chinese suppliers despite facing duties as high as 145%. According to a report from Mingpao Walmart Home Depot, and Target instructed Chinese exporters at the Canton Fair to restart paused shipments, calculating that either demand would remain resilient or tariffs would soften under political pressure. That decision wasn't based on blind optimism. It followed direct consultations with President Trump, after which several firms reportedly agreed to absorb the tariff costs themselves to stabilize product flow. The result, Walmart stock rose 11.7% in April, while Target fell 6.8%, reflecting the uneven market reaction to this strategic risk. But these were not bets without consequence, because had those tariffs held, some of that inventory would have turned toxic overnight. Because if they were wrong, the consequences weren't theoretical. They were sitting on pallets, unsellable, overpriced, and bleeding cash in real time. A $400 television imported at 145% tariff becomes a $980 retail liability before shipping, marketing, or overhead pricing it out of most consumer brackets. That's exactly the scenario. big box retailers nearly walked into this spring. According to FreightWaves, U.S. importers began freezing shipments and slashing volume by mid-April as the risk of unsellable stock grew. With millions of dollars in goods sitting inside FTZs or Canadian warehouses, the margin for error was vanishing. If those tariffs had remained, companies would have been forced to either liquidate at a loss or pass triple-digit price hikes to consumers already squeezed by inflation. The entire supply equation became a tightrope act too soon and risked massive losses. Wait too long, and shelves go bare. So when the Trump administration dropped tariffs to 30%, it wasn't just a policy shift, it was a lifeline. But that reduction didn't erase the underlying fragility it exposed. And yet, despite the looming disaster, orders didn't stop. In fact, they increased. Why? Because for these companies, standing still was a bigger risk than charging forward. The decision to restart Chinese shipments ahead of any formal policy easing was more than bold. It was based on survival math. Benzinga reported that after a closed-door White House meeting in late March, executives from Walmart, Target, and Home Depot pushed Chinese partners to fulfill dormant contracts despite record-high tariffs. This wasn't about optimism. It was hedging against empty inventories during peak consumer cycles. In some cases, the retailers agreed to internalize the tariff cost, preserving product flow and retail presence even at thinner margins. That decision also prevented long-term supply disruptions that could have handed market share to competitors using non-Chinese sourcing. Yet that gamble assumed tariffs wouldn't last, and that assumption, while accurate, depended on political timing no company could fully control. What it revealed is that some of America's largest firms are now functioning more like geopolitical analysts than retailers. But here's what no one expected. This wasn't driven by politicians or economists. The real masters of this trade war were hiding in logistics offices and port yards, rewriting the playbook as they went. In a crisis born from tariffs, it wasn't diplomats or economists who stabilized the system. It was warehouse managers, logistics chiefs, and import strategists. These were not passive handlers of product. They became real-time risk arbitrageurs, rerouting cargo mid-transit, leveraging FTZ loopholes, and repositioning inventory across international borders to buy time. Bloomberg's April trade data shows container volume at the Port of Los Angeles fell 18.8% year-over-year, while Canadian ports surged in traffic, reflecting this shift in strategy. The narrative shifted from just-in-time to just enough to survive. These managers used infrastructure tools, FTZs, bonded warehouses, and foreign routing not only to cut losses, but to preserve competitive advantage during a policy war. This wasn't improvisation. It was the emergence of a new tactical layer in global trade, one where logistics intelligence is as critical as pricing. And the ability to hold stock in the right jurisdiction now defines commercial power. FTZs gave U.S. retailers an edge. Canada gave them time. But China's watching, and it's already retaliating in oil and semiconductor flows. So what happens if Beijing shifts strategy, not with ships or tariffs, but by choking the re-export pipelines U.S. companies just relied on? If the next crackdown isn't about duties, but delivery control, the game changes entirely. And if FTZs become bottlenecks instead of buffers, this whole workaround collapses, because this isn't over, not by a long shot.